Double Cross Infinity Code. It's the latest, and as far as anyone knows, the last English sourcebook for Double Cross. It adds a lot to the game. It adds a new syndrome, new powers, new equipment, a whole lot of stuff. Let me show you everything that it has to offer. This time around, we start with some full-color illustrations, and a full-color explanation of what's in the book, for what that might be worth. Following that, still in color, we have 5 more sample characters, and each one of them uses the new syndrome, Ouroboros. Then the book goes black and white, with a brief and somewhat nonsensical comic, getting you into the feel of what Infinity Code is all about. This is easily one of my favorite syndromes. The premise of the Ouroboros syndrome is that it allows you to copy powers, and also has a few powers specifically for dealing with overheads. It can honestly do a little bit of everything, so if you're not sure what you want your second or even third syndrome to be, this isn't necessarily a bad choice. It does tend to focus mostly on renegade control powers though, with a little bit of melee powers. You're pretty well out of luck if you want to use ranged though. Many of the Ouroboros' powers also require one of two things. Either that you deal damage to an overhead before they can be used, or that you're using a copied power. Many of the copying powers follow the primordial something syntax, with the blank being a color of some sort. You only get one of each particular color though, so the amount of copying powers that an Ouroboros syndrome can actually do is kind of limited. Additionally, most of the primordial powers have a higher encroachment rate cost, or some other factor that makes them somewhat less useful. To make up for that though, some of the powers that enhance primordial powers can be very nasty. Chaotic Master gives a bonus to the final score on any check that uses a primordial power. Meanwhile, Fantastic Pigments turns any of your primordial powers into range view, which kinda makes up for the lack of ranged powers in Ouroboros. And what makes Ouroboros truly devastating when using copy powers is Eternal Evolution, which gives a +1 level bonus to all your primordial powers. Another interesting thing worth noting is the way that Ouroboros is represented in this book. There's more detail given regarding what they're capable of. That sort of format was what was going to be used in the revised Core Rulebook, which, unfortunately, is on an indefinite hiatus, along with any other double-cross translations. After the Ouroboros powers is a few pages with some of the new powers for all the other syndromes. There are 6 new powers for all the other syndromes, with the exception being Bram Stoker, and most of Bram Stoker's new powers focus on Red Servants, further solidifying that they were meant just to spew out a bunch of minions and bog everything down. There's also a few common simple powers as well, just in case you needed more options for simple powers. After the new powers, we have a few new unique items, as well as a bunch of unique items for the Ouroboros syndrome, which honestly hasn't existed until this book. Following that is yet more trait Loises that can be used by anybody, with the final 2 being available exclusively to Ouroboros. Then there are some more normal items that can be stocked and procured normally. Some of these are pretty similar to the ones found in the core book, but ultimately, this is just some more weapons, more armor, more other items, and more of everything, even if at first blush they seem to have the same or even identical stats. As with every sourcebook for Double Cross, this one adds some story information. This time it explains Professor Caldwell's plans, as well as the power structure of his allies. It also explains what exactly the appearance of Ouroboros is supposed to mean, and how it factors into the titular Infinity Code, including where the major organizations stand in regard to the Infinity Code. To sum that up, Caldwell seems to want more information regarding the Ouroboros and Infinity Code, nobody is sure why, and meanwhile the UGN doesn't know anything about the Ouroboros, and there's a third faction, Xenos, that consists mostly of renegade beings, that wants to eliminate the Ouroboros, and keep anybody from ever discovering the Infinity Code. And of course there's a few new NPCs, some of which touch on the ideas presented earlier. I'm a fan of games from the 80s and 90s, so I love it when games have subsystems and charts. And when you give me a subsystem that uses charts, it blows my mind. Infinity Code provides us with just that with progressive checks. To describe it briefly, it's a method of breaking down a large task into a smaller series of roles. It's also a little bit more involved than extended roles in other games like World of Darkness or Shadowrun. Basically, it slows in-game time down to combat rounds, and imposes a limit on how many rounds the players have to accomplish a given task. You still have setup, initiative, and action phases like in combat, and you can still use applicable powers. For your major action, you can decide to perform the task at hand, or to support somebody else as they perform the action. As successful rolls are gained, points are accrued towards succeeding in the objective. Every time so many points are gained, the circumstances change. A different skill might be rolled, or the difficulty of that roll might change, or both. Additionally, during every setup phase, a roll on the situation chart is made, which further changes how the progressive check progresses. Naturally, if a particular power can assist in a progressive check, the GM is advised to give bonuses to the player when they roll and use it. This is one of the aspects that's mostly open to GM interpretation. What I think makes progressive checks really interesting, though, is this. They're broken up into moments-long rounds. This means that a clever GM can find a way to incorporate this system into a combat scenario, so while some members are performing a task, others are fighting off enemies that want to get in the way. This book includes numerous suggestions for how you can use progressive checks, as well as guidelines on creating your own. Following up the progressive check system is 2 more scenarios. The first being an ideal introduction for both the Ouroboros syndrome, as well as progressive checks, and the second is a scenario that makes use of special and exhausted Loises, which are actually explained in the advanced rulebook. To summarize those here though, a special Lois is a Lois that's particularly important to the scenario or player character. Special Loises grant you more experience if you keep them to the end of the game, but if you turn them into Tituses, they grant you more powerful bonuses when you discard them, as opposed to what you would normally get for a normal Titus. Exhausted Loises, on the other hand, are meant to be used by enemies, and they basically make enemies all the more tougher than they normally ought to be. The plus side to encountering an enemy that uses an exhausted Lois, though, is this. They allow a player character to reduce their encroachment rate even further at the end of a session. The final thing that makes this book so great, though, is the scenario starters, which, unlike the small plot hooks from the Core Rulebook and Advanced Rulebook, these ones are a bit more detailed. And additionally, just in case you're unsure of how to use the progressive check system, they also include progressive check write-ups to go along with most of these, and some suggested stats for enemies in the scenario as well.
So there we have it, Double Cross Infinity Code. This is my favorite of all the source books for Double Cross, and it kind of makes me sad that this is also the last one, since 2015, Virgin Blue Entertainment has been on an indefinite hiatus for Double Cross. Which is kind of a shame, because this one also really showed how they were improving as a company. Anyways, this is one that'll really benefit anyone that wants to play Double Cross. So, with all that said, I am Aaron Schadel, and I will see you all next time.
Thanks for watching. If you found this review interesting or helpful, give me a click of that like button, or even the subscribe one. If you've got any questions regarding Double Cross, there's also a fairly active community dedicated to it on Google+, so swing by and somebody will be able to help. You might even run into me there.